while most genres have waxed and waned in popularity, the horror movie has been ever present and ever profitable since the inception of cinema. But even some of the greatest horror movies haven't received the respect or recognition that they deserved upon initial release. Perhaps they were overly ambitious. Maybe they came to a genre years or decades too early, setting out the playbook to be followed by genre filmmakers for years to come. And in some cases, the critics of their day just didn't like them at the time. But whatever the case, we're here to rectify that now by giving them their due day. So let's take a look. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 9 horror movies that were way ahead of their time. Number 9, 13 Women. The slasher subgenre would have its heyday from the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s, with hugely lucrative franchises built around the super simple formula of an unstoppable monster plus shrieking and often stupid victims plus gruesome murder. At their best, they were incredibly tense, visceral pictures bolstered by now classic horror characters. At their worst, they were the grimiest kind of schlock imaginable. For better or worse, much of the subgenre's lineage can be traced back to 1932's 13 Women. Directed by the prolific George Archambault, it establishes many of the format's tropes long before the slasher was a thing. As the title suggests, the film's victims are a baker's dozen of college friends, pursued to deadly ends by a childhood enemy who the gaggle dismissed for her mixed-race heritage. It's 1932, so the historic racism is unsurprisingly never addressed, but slasher flicks aren't exactly famous for their social awareness. 13 Women could be said to have established the final girl, here in the form of Laura, played by the hugely talented Irene Dunne. Cut to bits by the studio, whose 59-minute version makes 11 Women more of an accurate title, it's an intriguing cultural curio, if not a must-watch. Number 8, Dead of Night. The venerable British studio Ealing is best remembered for its string of classic comedies, many starring Alec Guinness. Before its golden period really began, though, it released Dead of Night, a cult favourite horror that was among the first to effectively blend scares with laughs. While the two genres don't necessarily seem like the most natural of combos, comedy and horror definitely go together surprisingly well. Both attempt to elicit an involuntary reaction from its audience, surprising viewers with something funny or scary enough that they can't help but react. Dead of Night takes place in a spooky country cottage and takes the form of an anthology comprising of 4 scary tales. There are plenty of classic horror tropes here, a haunted mirror, an evil ventriloquist dummy, but all are presented with Ealing's trademark wit and panache. This isn't a full-blooded comedy, it's foremost a creepy mood piece, but the mixture of frolics and frights creates an unsettling atmosphere. Horror comedies would have their heyday in the 2000s, but the film was equally pioneering as an anthology piece, which led to its natural endpoint, that being The Simpsons' treehouse of horror episodes. Number 7, Peeping Tom. If 13 Women inadvertently semi-invented slasher movies, 2 1960s films truly codified the subgenre. One, Psycho, was an immediate hit with audiences and critics alike. The other, Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, saw viewers turn away and the erstwhile celebrated director vilified. It's understandable to a point why Peeping Tom was subject to criticism. Its protagonist, Mark, is one of cinema's most subtly sinister characters. Played blankly by Carl Boehm, he's a young cameraman who murders women while watching the action through a viewfinder, later screening the footage for himself to relish the victim's fear. Like Psycho, Mark is given the kind of psychological profile that slasher writers would later lean on. In both cases, as with many films, it's parental abuse that turned the boy bad. Peeping Tom allows very little light into proceedings. We view almost everything through Mark's eyes. There's no hero coming to save the day here. It took a long time for critics to come around to Peeping Tom, but has since been recognised as one of the finest British horror movies ever made, not to mention one of the most influential. Even if regular audiences weren't watching it at the time, you can bet directors were. Number 6, Shivers. It didn't take long for the horror business to catch up with David Cronenberg, whose version of The Fly is amongst the best films of the 1980s. But in 1975, though, he was just finding his feet after a few self-produced features, although it didn't take him long. Working for the first time with a budget, albeit a seriously small one, with Shivers, Cronenberg set the template for the irresistibly disgusting and shocking pictures that would cement his legacy. The plot is typically Cronenberg. A seriously out-there mad scientist creates a parasite that sends its hosts into irresistible orgies of sex and violence, and releases it into a Montreal apartment block basically for a laugh. The script writes itself from there. Cronenberg's eye for gore is without peer, and the film, very much a cult affair, made its money back and then some. Shivers wasn't well received by critics, who didn't want to be seen to be supporting this kind of schlock, but Hollywood clearly saw something in the director, who'd go on to spend the next decade exploding heads, tearing off fingernails, and any other disgusting thing that he could imagine. Number 5, Demonseed. As years go by and artificial intelligence looms larger on the collective horizon, it stands to reason that our fiction is increasingly preoccupied with machines gone mad. To this end, Donald Cammell's 1977 sci-fi horror had a jump on what we'd come to fear in the future. Demonseed is a bizarre picture that takes 2001's HAL and runs wild with it. While Kubrick's computer was a malfunctioning menace, this one has a true mind of its own. The film stars Julie Christie as Susan, whose husband has developed a ludicrously intelligent computer. Proteus, the mechanical marvel, soon builds its own network of robot helpers, eventually trapping Susan with the intention of artificially inseminating her. This notion of robots reproducing, here both mechanically and biologically, taps into the idea of the singularity, a notion conceived in 1965 but discussed far more frequently today. Demonseed is no masterpiece, but it definitely boasts a genuinely great actress in the lead role, as well as a delightfully bonkers and pretty well presented ending. Number 4. The Thing. It's not too uncommon for a film to be dismissed upon release only for it to rise up in status, though rarely to the extent of John Carpenter's The Thing. The horror maestro's reboot of the 1951 feature was positively reviled upon release, with critics taking shot at nearly every aspect. They hated the plot, the characters, the structure, even the special effects, which were impossible not to praise, took flack for being simply far too horrible. Most detrimental to its success at the box office, though, was the bold and brilliantly bleak ending. Now, without spoiling, our protagonists find themselves picked in an Antarctic base by a shape-shifting, assimilating monster, and we're left completely in the dark at the end, with the survivors and the audience completely unable to tell who's human and who's a thing. In the era of E.T., this was a level of intergalactic paranoia that we just couldn't handle, a conclusion too bleak for mass consumption. Since then, the utter disaster ending has grown in popularity, with the likes of Wreck and The Mist becoming two films with miserable but totally appropriate conclusions. If such bleakness rarely turns a big buck, it certainly makes for a memorable movie. Number 3. Candyman. We're currently in a golden age of socially conscious horror, films that provide scares and thoughtful messages in an intelligent fashion, rather than just shoehorning hot topics into storytelling. But a picture that seems to seldom get the credit it deserves for helping kickstart this is 1992's Candyman. Parts of the film have entered into the horror pantheon, specifically the means by which the titular ghoul is summoned, by saying his name 5 times into a mirror. Less often discussed, though, is the unusually refined nature of the Candyman himself. A descendant of slaves in the 19th century, he fell in love with a white woman and as a result was killed by a mob. Now he haunts modern Chicago as a malevolent and murderous spirit. Candyman is a story about the power of stories as much as anything else. The Candyman kills primarily to keep his legend alive, reclaiming his strength, having lived and died in a time in which he had none. Number 2. Wes Craven's New Nightmare. The late great Wes Craven made one key mistake. 2 years after the fact, he directed a film which did the same thing as New Nightmare a bit better and in a far more accessible fashion. 1996's Scream is rightly considered a masterpiece, a postmodern picture that lampoons the convention of horror movies while existing within them. New Nightmare is weirder still. The 7th in the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and probably the best since the first, it stars Heather Langenkamp, Nancy from the original, as herself. She's asked to return to the franchise and is reluctant to do so until the actual Freddy Krueger emerges from the movie world to dish out real-life murders. The smartest thing New Nightmare does is take the wild concept more seriously than ever before. Krueger actor Robert Englund is sensational here, toning down the zaniness that had become Freddy's main trait and playing him as genuinely menacing. This could have so easily been stupid or self-indulgent, but instead it's probably the most unsettling installment the franchise has seen, and the last in the Craven-helmed series. It's a surprising but totally fitting send-off to a truly legendary movie monster. And number 1, The Ruins. Time will tell on this one, but Carter Smith's 2008 film feels like a cult hit ready to be discovered, and maybe, just maybe, the vanguard for a boom in the natural horror subgenre. The Ruins has the misfortune to share a vague plot description with M. Night Shyamalan's disastrous The Happening, Man vs. Plants. While Shyamalan's Bomb was melodramatic to the point of hilarity, though, The Ruins is a taut, fast-paced thrill ride to the extent that the fiendish flora make for a genuinely frightening foe. The film sees a group of travelers stumble upon a Mayan temple. They're met with hostility by the locals, and this only intensifies when the heroes brush against some vines. Immediately, the Mayans can think only of killing them, and as they run for their lives, the sinister vines slowly infect the protagonists. Unlike The Happening, The Ruins makes no attempt to explain away what's happening, but it's depicted well enough that it's easy to go along with, and Smith's direction is impressively subtle. He doesn't feel the need to go for the big scare every time, instead cranking up the tension in increments. And with the climate in crisis, it's hard not to see the planet's plant life striking back.